tragic story of the Rose family is considered one of the most bizarre and confusing crimes committed in America in recent years. This case struck investigators not only by its cynicism and cruelty, but also by the fact that the victims and the alleged perpetrators were close relatives. Despite the fact that many years have passed since the crime was committed and the perpetrator has long served his harsh sentence behind bars, there are still many questions and uncertainties in this story. Many still do not believe in the fairness of the court's verdict. Now let's get down to business. It was an ordinary, average family living in a provincial suburb of Bristol in the state of Tennessee and had never been on the radar of law enforcers before. The family was headed by an elderly couple, Curtis and Lena Maria Rose, who had lived together for over 40 years. They had 2 grown daughters and 6 grandchildren, but we will only look at those family members who were directly involved in this high-profile case. At the time of the crime, in the house and the surrounding area were the elderly owners themselves, Curtis and Lena Maria Rose, their eldest daughter, 39-year-old Tasha Milhorn, with her husband James and 6 children. 2 of the children were Tasha and James's shared children, while the other 4 were their heirs from previous relationships. Also present in the house was a neighborhood girl who had stopped by to play with them. It is worth noting that Tasha, James, and their children had been living at Tasha's parents' house for about 2 months, as their own home was undergoing renovations at the time. Later, another key player in those events, 19-year-old Seth Denton, arrived at the house. He was Tasha's eldest son, but his relationship with his mother and stepfather was strained, to put it mildly, and they avoided communicating with each other in every possible way. Their last meeting ended in tragedy. According to neighbors, the Rose couple was quite happy and prosperous. Their daughter, Tasha, was also happily married to James, who worked as an auto mechanic and was fond of restoring vintage cars. It was the Rose couple's family home that became the scene of the carnage. Police officers who arrived on the call later dubbed it the worst crime scene they had ever seen and the bloodiest in the history of their quiet county. The bodies of 2 women, Lena Maria and Tasha, a mother and daughter, were found in the house, shot almost point blank. Tasha was in a chair at the dining room table, and her mother was lying on the floor between the table and the refrigerator. Also lying on the doorstep of the house was the critically wounded James, Tasha's husband, who was quickly rushed to the hospital. Despite the efforts of the doctors, the man soon died of extensive internal injuries and massive blood loss. None of the children in the house were injured. It is likely that they were not targeted by the shooter or were simply not in his field of vision at the time of the massacre of the adults. Almost immediately after the crime, the police received 2 phone calls, one after the other. The first call came from the owner of the house, Curtis Rose, who said that his eldest grandson, Seth, had committed a shooting in the house and then fled the scene. However, soon after, there was a call from Seth himself, who told a different version of what had happened and blamed everything on his grandfather, Curtis. In addition, it turned out that Seth was wounded in the arm. Curtis admitted to shooting him, saying that he was trying to detain his grandson and not let him escape from the scene of the massacre. The alleged killer, Seth Denton, was arrested in the hospital, where he sought medical help for his wound. The investigation then had to restore the chain of tragic events and determine what really happened in the Rose family home. Surprisingly, only one version of events was initially taken as the basis for the investigation, while the second version was taken seriously only a few years later. On August 29, 2015, around 6 o'clock in the evening, residents of houses located near the scene of the crime heard a series of gunshots. No one paid much attention to it, as there were forests around where hunting of wild animals and birds was allowed. Later, one of the neighbors noted that he was a little alarmed by the number of shots and then the sudden silence, but he did not consider it a good reason to call the police. Another neighbor testified at trial that, in addition to the gunshots, he heard screaming and went out onto the porch of his house to see what was going on. At that point, he saw a young man running down the path from the neighbor's house to a car parked by the road. He was being chased by another man, but because of the trees by the road, the witness had a poor view of what was happening. He only saw the young man jump into the vehicle. Then 2 shots rang out and the car sped off. Just a few minutes later, neighbors heard the wailing of sirens and saw police cars and emergency vehicles arriving at the Rose house. Soon, an air ambulance helicopter landed on the lawn outside the house. Arriving to pick up James, who was still alive. Everything that was happening resembled the shooting of some movie, and none of the eyewitnesses understood what had happened. Arriving police officers were met by the elderly owner of the house, who was holding a firearm. Another gun belonging to him was later found in his bedroom. Curtis told his version of events, which was taken as the basis of the investigation and was long believed to be the only one. According to Curtis, there was nothing to suggest trouble that day. His daughter, son-in-law, grandchildren, and a neighbor's child, who came to play, were visiting the house. Curtis himself was tinkering in his trailer in the backyard when he heard the sounds of gunshots. Like most neighbors, he didn't pay much attention, assuming it was hunters in the woods. Suddenly, his oldest grandson, Seth, appeared at the trailer, arriving unannounced and looking very excited. The young man said there had been some kind of tragedy and asked him to call emergency services immediately. Curtis followed his grandson into the house, where he immediately came across the dead bodies of his wife and daughter. Curtis immediately thought of the children in the house. They were in another room, frightened but unharmed. He took them to the back of the house and locked them up so they wouldn't see the horror unfolding. While Curtis was calling emergency services, he saw his grandson hurriedly leaving the house and running toward the road. The homeowner drew his gun and began to chase Seth, believing that he was the killer. As Seth jumped into the car, Curtis fired 2 shots. One bullet shattered the rear window without hitting the driver, and the second bullet hit Seth in the left shoulder. Despite the injury, Seth managed to get away, but after reaching the nearest house, he stopped to call the police and report what had happened. The local sheriff investigating the case was puzzled. The crime scene looked so strange and illogical that similar cases simply did not exist in his memory. In a breaking news report, he said that investigators had a difficult job ahead of them to reconstruct the whole picture of the crime. After the arrest of Seth Denton, it was necessary to establish the motive. Why had the young man treated his family members so cruelly? Surprisingly, a motive was quickly found. Seth was the eldest child of his mother, Tasha, who had given birth to him in her early youth. Her relationship with the boy's father did not work out, and his upbringing was mostly handled by his grandparents while Tasha settled her personal life. According to some reports, Tasha suffered from bipolar affective disorder and periodically went to a clinic. Most likely her son could have inherited this disease. Since childhood, Seth had harbored strong resentment toward his mother, whom he hardly ever saw. With age, this feeling turned into hatred, something Seth often mentioned to friends and relatives. After graduating from high school, Seth decided to serve in the Army. A year later, upon returning home, he settled with his grandparents. However, he soon decided that he wanted to start an independent life and moved to the city, where he rented a small apartment with a friend. He got a job at a local fast food restaurant, but was fired shortly before the tragedy. Family and friends spoke positively about Seth, noting that he never had any violent tendencies, did not associate with bad influences, and never broke the law. Despite these positive characteristics, detectives considered that the main motive for the crime was Seth's negative feelings toward his mother and her current spouse. According to the investigation, the events of that day unfolded as follows. Around 5 p.m., Seth drove his car to his grandparents' house. He was wearing a camouflage jacket, and a semi-automatic rifle lay in his car. He left the car by the roadside and, with the weapon in hand, entered the house through the back door. Seth then fired several shots, killing his mother and grandmother and severely wounding his stepfather before leaving his jacket and rifle by the back door. He then went to his grandfather's house and asked him to call the police. The order in which the shots were fired was never determined because Seth completely denied his guilt. In addition, it was unclear why he asked his grandfather to call the police rather than fleeing the scene immediately. It is assumed that his main targets were his mother and stepfather, and that he killed his grandmother as an unnecessary witness. The primary evidence proving Seth's guilt included his jacket and rifle found at the back door of the house, traces of blood on his shoes, and bullets found in his car. Remarkably, about 100 rounds of ammunition were found, but no one questioned why he needed so many if he only planned to kill 2 people. Another oddity was the timing. According to the grandfather, after he and Seth entered the house and witnessed the horrifying scene, Seth hurriedly left. Curtis then found and secured the children, called the police, retrieved his gun, and after all this still managed to catch up with Seth and shoot him twice. It was not until 2016 that Seth presented his version of what happened in court, a version that had never been considered before. According to Seth, he had always been very close to his grandparents, who raised him, but he avoided meeting his mother by all means. As a teenager, he often went to shooting ranges with his grandfather, who encouraged him to join the army. On that fateful day, Seth called his maternal aunt, Amanda, his mother's younger sister, and told her he was going to visit his grandparents but didn't want to meet his mother there. The woman did not know that Tasha and her husband were visiting her parents, so she assured Seth that he could go without fear of crossing paths with his mother and stepfather. Amanda confirmed that information in court, noting that her nephew couldn't have known that Tasha and James were at Rose's house. Seth had hoped that he and his grandfather would go to the shooting range, which was why he had brought a rifle with so many rounds of ammunition. He drove up to the house, got the gun, and went straight to the trailer where his grandfather usually worked. There, Seth showed Curtis his rifle, and they had a short discussion about it. Curtis then headed for the house, still holding the rifle, and his grandson followed him. Seth knew that his grandfather had a gun and expected him to bring it along so they could shoot targets together. However, when Curtis entered the room, he immediately opened fire. The people inside did not even have time to realize what was happening, nor did they try to run or hide. According to Seth's lawyers, Curtis may have suffered from temporary insanity when he killed his family members. However, this theory was dismissed early on and was not seriously considered in court. Despite traces of the victim's blood being found on Curtis's clothes and shoes, he was never considered a suspect from the beginning. The young man in the dock was facing the death penalty for the premeditated triple murder of his family members. His grandfather had been a key witness in the case from the start, and despite openly stating that he had been prepared to kill his grandson that day, the court found such behavior justified. Curtis Rose was never taken to the station for questioning as a suspect, and his version of events was accepted as the only truth. Additionally, many inconsistencies were simply overlooked, and Seth's version of events was not considered until a year and a half after the crime. Most of the physical evidence did support Curtis's testimony, but the details that did not fit were somehow ignored by the investigation. The main argument in court was that Mr. Rose had no clear motive for killing his wife, daughter, and son-in-law. The theory of temporary insanity seemed implausible and was ultimately dismissed. The trial lasted more than a week, during which nearly 200 pieces of evidence were presented, and dozens of witnesses, including neighbors, relatives, and family friends, testified. The testimonies of the grandfather and grandson completely contradicted each other, making it obvious that one of them was lying. The jury deliberated for several days. They admitted to being emotionally and physically exhausted, but when it came to a verdict, they unanimously agreed that they had no doubt about the defendant's guilt. Seth Denton was found guilty of triple murder. However, after a detailed review of all the evidence and circumstances of the tragedy, the court decided to exclude the death penalty from the possible punishments, reducing the sentence to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for at least 50 years. Seth never admitted guilt. He is currently serving his sentence in a Tennessee prison. As for the orphaned children of Tasha and James Mulhorn, they were left in the care of other family members, including their aunt Amanda and grandfather Curtis.